Right, good afternoon, everybody. What are you doing here? I mean, there's so many people. Meaning, I give many speeches in this room. We could have come out in other occasions, but it must not be for me, I guess. Uh, Today is a special day. Huh? 2020, I've been saying this already this morning in a meeting that we had. 2020 has been called a special year by many people, in particular because of the Sustainable Development Goals, because of the many, many things that need to be done this year. Uh, if this is a special year, 19th of February is a special day. Or if you want, as the Americans brace for Super Tuesday, we Europeans get our Super Wednesday today. And I'm not kidding, it's not just playing with words. Today, even if many of us have been waiting for this and working on this, of course, in particular, Vice President Vestager and the services and the cabinet members that are here represented for months and years. But what is happening today shouldn't be underestimated, because the European Commission is presenting a very comprehensive, very well-written, very sophisticated, very balanced package of potential reforms, orientations, priorities for the future in one of the most controversial, most high potential, let's say, widely acknowledged policy area of modern times, contemporary times. Artificial intelligence, the data economy, and all the areas of the digital transformation on which many of us place expectations, hopes, and fears. So in an op-ed that is about to be published by CEPS, I called it also Europe's Digital Independence Day. And this is also because the package that many of us have had the possibility to read a little bit in advance due to the various leaks, but that we see in its full-fledged version now online, is a package that is very assertive. It's a package that is self-confident. It's not a package that solves all problems immediately. It is the beginning of a long journey. It is a package that many of us have awaited for a long time. We at CEPS have been waiting for this for a long time, since when we did the task force on artificial intelligence last year. I have been waiting as a member of the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence for this package for a long time, and seeing some of these inputs being translated into concrete proposals is an honor and a pleasure. Many of you, for different reasons, have been waiting for this and will react in different ways. But it's time to hear about the content of this package from the person that more than anybody else represents this package in Europe and beyond. And we are so honored of the fact that you have chosen to come to CEPS to discuss and present. And you even brought slides. Sometimes we ask our speakers to bring slides and they don't. So you came, and you came with slides. And we are very eager to listen to your words and to also discuss with you how do you see this journey unfolding in the weeks to come. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, a big applause to Vice President Margrethe Vestager.
I'd say after such recommendation, actually, I should just leave it. Because that is obviously too kind. It is indeed correct that I have brought PowerPoints 4 in order to prevent death from PowerPoints. I know how toxic it is. But it is a relatively complex package. And I will go through things, and then, of course, you will be looking forward for me to stop. And I'll be looking forward to hear your questions, because in your questions and comments, I basically pick your brain. We presented today, first and foremost, sort of the overarching vision. And that is in the first slide. And that comes from the fact that I've had a thing about figuring out, well, what does it mean to be Executive Vice President for Europe Fit for Digital Age? Because should we fit into a template that is defined by engineers, or what is it? Because it is obvious that to some degree, of course, we need to deal with technology, to have the skills, the insights, both to create it, but also to work with it. We can rethink our business models. There are a number of things that we would do in order to sort of change our behavior, our educational system, due to technology. But that is not the point of a democracy. The point of a democracy is that we do our best together after thorough debates, discussions, we take decisions in order to shape our future. And this was why we chose sort of a different approach from a technological approach. The idea was to say, well, this is about how we as citizens in Europe would want to use technology as a tool to make come true some of the dreams that we have had and maybe not been able to realize for decades. And this is why shaping Europe's digital future for us is seen as a puzzle, something that will have to come together with a number of different initiatives and different work strands. And the two we present here today, a European strategy for data and the white paper on artificial intelligence. But when the puzzle is done, our hope and ambition is that three things will come forward in the puzzle being laid. First and foremost, that technology works for people and not the other way around. I was thinking about it when I saw The Parasite, now an Oscar-winning movie, because here you see the two different situations in two very different families. You see, in the poor family, they literally have their phones glued to their hands. The worst thing that can happen is for Wi-Fi to go down. They are basically digital all the time. This is how they make their living. They are just part of an all-encompassing digital economy. In the rich family, and they have made their fortune from digital gadgets, there's no technology. The son is into arts and painting. The daughter is learning English as a language. The mother is into worrying. They have, you know, what we would consider sort of all that comes with humanity: art, language, interaction. Where the poor family, they're left with their digital tools. And that exactly to make sure that we do not get such a society where some are just the input in a digital production chain and some are the ones to reap the benefits of that. Second, of course, that we then have a fair and competitive economy, that we have a single market where businesses can make the most of their talents, where new business models, where new ways of creating value can unfold themselves, and that it is a necessity in order to make the best of digital tools to have a full single market in order to have sufficient customers to make the best of it. And obviously, the basis of it all is to have an open, democratic, and sustainable society. Because as our President von der Leyen has said, it may be new technology, but it shouldn't come with new values, because the values are the same. We want a society where people feel counted in, feel at home, feel that they are here, and the society is being built in order to serve them the best possible way. And sustainability becomes then something that goes hand in hand with digital transition and something that we in itself want to achieve, because we don't think that you can have a carbon or climate neutral continent without digital solutions in many, 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 many different ways. So the two different papers, the first one, as said, I haven't worked one of these for maybe 10 years because I never do slides. Oh, wow. I see. The idea of the white paper is two things that comes together. because we come from a point of view of optimism, that we have new tools and we can make good use of these tools. That technology in itself is neither good nor bad. It all depends on the use. And this is why we have this double construction to create an ecosystem of excellence and an ecosystem of trust. And one of the things we come back to all the time is this question of trust. Because as we speak, trust in technology is falling. I don't necessarily think for some specific reason, but maybe this sense of, this is not nice. In Denmark right now, we have a discussion about a closed Instagram group where young women exchange on self-harm and suicide. I think everyone who knows about this will find this to be a very scary thing, how to address it. Most people have had a mail from some Nigerian prince who just need your bank account in order to transfer you €1 million. Most people have heard about attacks in companies. They've heard about sort of old school robberies now being digital, about data being taken hostage. There's a whole scary world out there. And if you find that you're not in control, then better be cautious. Which is why in itself, it's a thing for us to build trust that we can make the most of digital technologies. And to make the most of technologies, then a couple of obvious enablers. First one, no question, funding. We are way behind. When we compare public-private investments to both Chinese and US public and private investment, we're hardly even on the scale. So we need funding, not only European funding, national funding, but obviously also to crowd in a lot of private funding, because otherwise we'll not get to what we suggest, sort of a ballpark figure, 20 billion per year. Second, even if we get to 20 billion per year, we need to make sure that we spend it wisely, that we have an efficient organization as to how we do research and development. And this is why we suggest to discuss having a lighthouse. You probably know that the Brits, they left with a couple of universities. Now better figure out how to make sure that some of the most talented people, they also want to spend their time here. Also to attract talent from young people, say, oh, this is what I want to do. Because having a lighthouse, you can also have a network of centers of excellence all over the Union. Talent and skills is a specific issue. We have a huge gap, both when it comes to female talent in technology and in AI also, but also just when it comes to dealing with AI that has been developed, we are in huge demand of skills. Then we have the physical infrastructure. What we need the high-performance computers, the quantum computing as well. We need the grid to work efficiently. Also here, a lot of investment is needed in the future. And last but not least, you can have excellent research, excellent development. If never deployed, doesn't make any sense. So how to enable small and medium-sized businesses to make full use? Here we see a role for the digital innovation hubs to play a role in each member state, probably also doing sandboxing here and there in order for businesses to sort of reimagine their business model in order actually to deploy. Then on the trust side of things, we've been looking and going through different ways where we find that technology embodying artificial intelligence can be risky to fundamental values. It can be a question of not being discriminated, being able to freely assemble. It could be questions of material, immaterial harm to people and to things. So areas where we find this may actually pose some risk to something that we find to be fundamental. And if things are posing a risk to something that we find to be fundamental and important, well, we will try to manage those risks. And in order to do so, we suggest a scoping to say, well, there are a number of sectors where we'd always be cautious. Recruitment, health, transport, electricity, police, courts, so parts of the public sector as well. And there will be a number of applications where we would feel that here you need to be vigilant as well. Because not everything within the health sector poses a risk to fundamental values. My guess would be that it's very difficult to make a booking system be a real threat. If you're not having your booking, you would call them and say something happened. But in the other end of the spectrum, if the AI helping your doctor to diagnose a malign cancer, well, then it's quite critical if it works or not. So it's both the sector that we're in and how it's put into use. If technology is found to be within this scoping, then a number of requirements. First, on the data. You are what you eat. That also goes for artificial intelligence to a very large degree, at least. So what data was it trained on? What's the quality of the data? Keeping records of the data so that there's traceability. What kind of information do you need to have? Because maybe it's trained on data that then limits the use. Because it can very well be that you train on data, but the data set is limited in its quality, so the AI will have the same and share the same limitations. Fourthly, sort of the robustness and accuracy as to how it's actually working, that it is really working and that it's tested to be working. And last but not least, that there's human oversight. That somewhere in the loop, you can actually find that human intervention is possible. We have built this on the basis of the work done on the expert group on ethics to create trustworthy AI. And without them, I don't think it would be possible to be here today. Because that work, that thorough work, then tested in 350 different businesses to see how to work with this, that is the basics that we have been building on. And I think from those 7 principles, you'd find more or less sort of the same content that we try to boil down to these 4 areas. And the reason why we try to boil it down is, of course, that we would want to enforce it. So try to make sure that we get something that is actually enforceable instead of getting a full filigrane of everything that would be nice, but then more tricky to enforce. And in order to enforce, to do an ex-ante test, to be able to label it safe, to be able to say, well, this can actually be put into use, and if not, there will be sanctions. In that, of course, you need a governance structure. And here we put out for debate, because this is always tricky in a European context, who should do what. Probably one of the things that has been discussed the most next to money. Who should do what? And the thing is that if we want a single market for artificial intelligence, we need to make sure that if you have national assessments, ex ante, if things are safe or not, then it has to be done in the same way. Because otherwise, how will you know that it is safe? You would want to use artificial intelligence tested in France to be trusted in Denmark. And this is why a governance structure is absolutely needed. If you're not sort of in the scoping of risky, well, then we suggest a voluntary assessment scheme that you can sign up for. If you sign up, obviously, then, well, you take upon yourself obligations. Last but not least, we have been looking into sort of the question of safety and liability. Because, breaking news, we have legislation already. A lot of that deals with safety and liability. And a lot of the gadgets you have in your hands right now will be covered by safety and liability rules already. And a lot of that will have AI already. So what the service has been trying to do is to go through that to see, well, where does the nature of artificial intelligence, and part of that nature being somewhat opaque, how would that challenge how safety and liability is assessed today? in order to be sort of more precise as to how legislation might need to be changed, instead of just suggesting sort of a blanket set of new rules to be put on top of everything else, with then more administrative burdens on everyone. So trying to frame it in order not to overdo it. And this white paper is now for a 12-week consultation process in order for us to get the necessary feedback to see if on the ecosystem of trust legislation can be scoped so that both the scoping, the obligations, the enforcement, and the governance structure become something that we can work with. The last thing I will present is the strategy for data. Because as said, we are what we eat. Same goes for artificial intelligence. No data, no artificial intelligence. And the good news is we have plenty. The bad news is not very well organized. One of the good things is that data will be created in increasing and ever increasing amounts in the coming years. Europe has a stronghold when it comes to industrial data, Internet of Things data, and business-to-business technology. I think it's obvious for everyone that we kind of missed the train when it came to social media. But so far, so good. Here, there are really a chance not to be missed. And this is why we suggest to create a common European data space or a single market for data. And data space should be understood as a metaphor, because the nature of data and how it is sufficiently put together will very much depend on different sectors. Health data and records are not the same as the data you would need to do precision agriculture. But a data space should be understood as a way of enabling data to be shared. So maybe standard contractual obligations so that you can very easily sort of clear the legal requirements to share things. Can be standard setting as to how should data present itself so that it's actually cross-readable. And it makes sense for you to share data instead of just creating a full pile of it. So a lot of what is ahead of us in order to enable a single market for data is to make sure that all these things that seems to be between, for instance, a business and the next business, that these barriers, they are taken down. When I fly out of Copenhagen, sometimes there's this giant poster which says that basically the short version, data is the new gold. You're sitting on it. And I think that makes a lot of people sort of curious. Well, how do I then get the price of gold for my data? And since that can be kind of tricky to figure out, then you do nothing, and then the value is nothing. So the point is to say, well, forget about this sitting on gold. Because if you don't use it already, well, the value can only increase if you use it with other people. And it's in the pooling of data that you have a potential of creating value. So in order to enable that, and of course, in particular, with a view to small and medium-sized businesses who may not have these capabilities themselves, how to make that happen. All of that, and that of course should go without saying, with respect of GDPR and the legislation that we have in practice already. The last slide. Wow. Wow. There you see. Yeah, it reads my mind. The data strategy consists of 4 pillars. First, the governance framework, which is basically to say that we would suggest a data act. Second, enablers. We will try to do our best to find 2 billion, hope to crowd in another at least 4 billion in order to make also European data spaces, enabling sharing, making an architecture and a governance mechanism in order to make this happen. Because there's also an infrastructure point to this. Of course, a legal contract is also infrastructure, only legal infrastructure, and that is obviously needed. Here again, the obvious point of skills. We will present a skills strategy. It's Maria Gabriel who is in charge of that, and she will do that in the coming month. And as you can see, well, to see how data governance and practical arrangements can come together. There's been some back and forth about localization. We do not suggest that data should be localized in Europe, but we suggest that it could be a good thing if data can be localized in Europe, and if businesses see that this is actually practically available in the right quality and where you want to use it. Because that brings me to the last point, which is the international aspect. One of the things that we have been discussing intensively internally among ourselves is this concept of technological sovereignty and data sovereignty. What does that mean? Because it can easily be misunderstood as something against the others. What we have settled with is try to word it in a way to say, well, this is about us. This is about being capable of doing things. If we have the capacity and the talent and the funding to do the research, the development, the industrial use, the deployment of artificial intelligence, well, then we have a much stronger say as to how it should be regulated or not regulated. If we're not capable of doing any of those things, we will just be the takers. And the ambition is not just to be the takers. The ambition is to say, well, we can do this, and we will do it in a European manner. And on that basis, of course, we'll deal with the rest of the world. Because there is a good thing about data, and that is that it travels easily. The thing is, it should also travel safely. And that is, of course, why it's important for us to keep doing the assessment as to how is data treated in other jurisdictions, how is European data treated in other jurisdictions. But what has made Europe prosperous? Well, that is our openness, that is our trade, that is how we interact with other people in combination with the European model. Because over decades, we have had the willingness to say, well, there are things that we want, and there are things that we don't want. And I use a kind of old school example here, because, for instance, when it comes to farming and agriculture, in our democracies, we have discussed and decided and banned a number of pesticides, while others have been allowed, and there's been set values as to how much you can use. But we had the willingness to ban some pesticides, knowingly that maybe for some purposes they would be useful. But since we would not take a chance on biodiversity and our drinking water, we have taken this decision. And it's basically the same thing we do here, only now it's in a digital dress. That there are things that we really, really want, but there's also things where we say, no, actually, we don't want this. We don't want our privacy for sale. We don't want to have a situation where everything goes. And that is a European way. But the strange thing and the magic of the European way is that it also works on an open planet. Because trades, multilateralism, engagement, that is the other side of that European way. And that is also what our digital strategy builds on, because only then we can be shaping our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, what I call a declaration of independence is not a declaration of war. It is not, and independence is not autarky, right? And this is why I think it is very important to discuss how do we make this happen together, since it's for us. I want to open the floor to questions, and with the prayer to be short and concise in your questions, because I would expect to receive many requests. Yes. This is what I would expect. Let me see. There's one here, one there. Okay. You have a microphone, Nadina, our colleague. So you can start from here. There. Please introduce yourself and ask a very brief question.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Nora. I'm working for a consultancy called Teneo. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question that is maybe a little bit more technical on this communication you published today on shaping a European digital future. When you speak about competition policy, and you say that not all the problems can be, all the systemic problems can be addressed with competition policy, but there could be additional rules, if you can expand a bit there. And also another question related to this sector inquiry that you plan to do. I know this is a question that you received also during the press conference, but if you could expand a little bit more which markets you have in mind for this sector inquiry.
Vice President, is it okay if I collect a few questions, or if you prefer, you respond immediately? Yeah?
Well, usually it's easier to detect if I evade a question, if I answer them one by one.
One by one.
On the question of sector inquiry, we are fast, but not so fast that the answer has changed since an hour and a half ago. We're still sort of working within the scoping that the President gave us. On your first question, one of the things that I have seen in the first 5 years is that competition law enforcement in the specific cases should call in her sister regulation, and they should work hand in hand. I think as a good example, what we see is that sort of the specific competition law enforcement can do things when we have a suspicion, we find the evidence, we can take a decision. Eventually, we will end up in court to be challenged if we are right or wrong. But the thing is that being a dominant company today is something completely different than what it was back in the old days 10, 15 years ago. So we have to figure out, well, what are your obligations as a dominant company sort of ex ante? Not when we have the suspicion that you have done something wrong, but just because you're big. Because it is a European thing that we welcome success. You welcome to grow. We do not have a ban on monopolies. But with great powers also comes great responsibility. So what we are considering is what would be your responsibility as a dominant market player without taking into consideration legal or illegal or not. Because if you have a nature of being a gatekeeper, a necessity for other people in doing business, then you'd see, well, then it's a different creature. The first steps have been taken with the platform to business regulation that gives platforms responsibility and give rights to their customers. And I think it's more like in that direction that our work will take us.
Thank you. We go to the other side of the room, and one of the only cases in which I've seen someone be so tall that he go into the screen, basically the projection of the projector. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Matthias and I work for the consultancy Busson Cohn & Wolf. Thank you very much for the presentation and for the whole work on this. I had a question. You referenced pesticides and compared to privacy for sale and the fact that we don't really want that in Europe. And how do you think that's going to work with some of the major players in the US or in China, which the whole business model is based on exploiting privacy and private data? And do you expect more tensions regarding this topic?
Well, one of the things that we also spell out very clearly is a wish to give people better tools to enforce their rights. And also a slight disappointment that the market has not been more helpful. Because that was the expectation when we were given digital rights, that the market would respond and help us to enforce our rights. And that it would be a thing that you could be helped. Because now I read terms and conditions for fun, but this is because I have a strange sense of humor. Not many people do that. So we have a thing that is not only about how to make sure that players respect GDPR, but also how do we enable people to be in control of their data and to feel for real, I am in control of my data. I may give consent so that you can use my data to whatever, because we have different preferences. I really think some people, they really don't mind. But then you should know that this is what you're doing. So we have this double approach. When it comes to tensions, I think this is difficult to assess right now, because it is as if the global debate is changing. We see how the GDPR has inspired debates, consideration basically all over the planet. You see how big tech is lining up to say that maybe regulation is unavoidable. So I think there's a change in the debate as such, and that may also help us not to have tensions, because the point is, of course, not to have tensions. Why would we? The point is to make sure that citizens, they feel that tech is here to serve them.
Thank you very much. We had the gentleman over there. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you very much for this very interesting topic, and this all the work you've done. It was much necessary and it's much appreciated. My name is Eric Pierce. I'm from Finabel. My question is mostly on competition within the union, on the different technological aspects and AI especially. I'm mostly thinking about Germany. Recently released their strategy document on certain cyber technologies being a national like a national asset, and it seems to me that that closes then, of course, the doors towards EU competition and towards the other EU companies on certain AI assets. How do you plan to deal with this, and how will this be dealt with in your commission? Thank you.
But some of this I find tricky myself. In this new capacity, I have a bigger responsibility both for cross-fertilization, but also to some degree for security. And if I thought that competition law enforcement was a tricky thing to do, I think, well, this is difficult. Because here you have a gray zone between very strong, unquestioned national competences when it comes to security, an obvious need to do things together, because the assets, the skills, the people, the technology, really to make sure that you stay safe, also cyber-wise, is as obvious, I think, as the national competence and the national responsibility to do that. So it is a tricky thing, and it's also a tricky thing because something that you would not consider to be a thing of a hybrid threat or a cyber risk can tend to be that. Because things that seem completely innocent can be things that can be used to rock your democracy. So in that respect, I think it's early days. I hope very much that we will be able to establish a common sort of cyber unit in order to help out, because it is a thing to have the right capacities, the right people, the technology yourself, to fend for yourself. Because as we speak, many businesses will be attacked in cyber attacks. It happens all days, all times, and it has to be a thing that we consider. And I understand why member states, they say, we need to make sure that we can tell to citizens that also this part of being safe is something that we care about. My point is just to say that if you want to make sure that that is real, then you would want to work together with your neighbors.
Thank you. The gentleman over there.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I am a PhD student in Toulouse. I'm working in competition law, interplay between competition law and data protection. I would like to ask you two questions. The first question is is related, to the localization of data. You mentioned that you are not that according to you, the Commission is not in favor of localizing the data or within the European Union, or at least they shouldn't. It shouldn't be the mandatory. But the new commissioner, the new French commissioner in Politico said a little bit, I think, the contrary, that they should be localized in the European Union in Politico today. In one article, so I just wanted to have your point of view concerning this question. And the second point is related to the position of the European Commission concerning the use of different regulatory techniques such as co-regulation or self-regulation in the field of artificial intelligence, because it was already a point discussed within in the GDPR with the privacy by design. And I just would like to know your point of view concerning the use of other regulatory tools such as co-regulation in the field of artificial intelligence to tackle the privacy issues or competition issues in this field. Thank you.
On the first question, I don't know what is the story behind the story in Politico. What you will find in our papers is to say that we would love to give an incentive to store your data also within a European geographical context, but not to give you an obligation to do so. And the thing is that you find European cloud providers, they just do not have much cloud. They're not too visible. They can give you a different quality. They can give you a different service, but they can be difficult to find because cheaper giant alternatives, they make themselves readily available because very often they're connected to the services that you use. And that in itself is a question how to make sure that you still have access to a certain service that goes with other technologies that you use while being free to store your data where you want to store it. And that is basically what we want to enable. Also here you see that some member states, they have been pushing this, the Gaia X being one example of that. I think the French also have their ideas. But to make it a thing that you have a European alternative that you can choose to use. The second question, I wouldn't know an exact answer to that. I find it intriguing to hear about sort of different ways of approaching things like sandboxing, for instance, being more open to test things out. One of the reasons why I find it intriguing is that most of the things I do, they are being tested, but in court. And that is not a sandbox. So I may have a little bit of reluctance, at least when you get to issues where you find that this is actually something where we insist. There is something that you can do, and we're fine, and there's something, don't do this. Then I think we need old school, proper, well-designed, well-discussed, by the legislator approved legislation.
Right, thank you. We go here.
I'm Karina Stan, Developers Alliance, and you know, the developer community work is global, and how are we going to achieve the objectives of the digital strategies? And I'm thinking with this restricted, in my opinion, system of certification, ex-ante conformity certification, and I'm referring especially to the obligations such as retraining the AI systems in the EU. Thank you.
Yes. Of course, one can see things in different ways. Of course, what we have tried is to balance things, as said, coming from a sort of a optimistic point of view that with new tools we can better shape our future. The point on data among the requirements is not a requirement to retrain things on European data. It is to say, well, you should be able to sort of vouch for your data. To say, well, this was the data that we used. It has been, it has these different qualities, and because of these qualities, well, then you can trust what the algorithm has developed with this data. And maybe you'd also be asked to trace these data back. So it's not something that you say, but if there is a thing that it can actually be traced back in the data. But we do not have a proposal that things should be retrained in Europe on European data.
All right, thank you. Yes, at the
Yes.
corner there.
Hello, my name is Bert Heck from BBVA, the Spanish bank. And I've got a question concerning the tools you mentioned before to empower the individuals to control their data. And one of these tools that you mentioned also in the communication in the data strategy is the enhanced right for data portability according to GDPR. And how does the Commission envision that this could happen operationally? How could this be operationalized? How can we ensure that firms enable consumers to port their data safely and easily? And how could they be incentivized to do so?
Well, that is a very good question, and I'm definitely not the right person to ask. Because when it comes to how technically, operationally to set it up, I wouldn't know that. I would be the first to use it, because I feel to a very strong degree not able to choose a different provider from the one I have already. Because I would have no idea how to make sure that, give or take, 21,000 pictures of my children would come safely into another environment. And it also have a thing to do with competition law, because one of the reasons why we will review the notice of market definition is exactly that market changes when what you are met with as a consumer is not necessarily that prices change, but that the demands of data change or the way you can handle your data diminish. It's quite tricky to assess as a consumer if the demands of data is going up as a payment for the service that you use. Kind of tricky. Much easier to see if prices increase and say, oh no, now it's expensive, now I leave. That's much easier to assess than to do an assessment of what happens if sort of the ask of data increases. Or it is even more difficult for me to say, no, now I take my data and I go somewhere else. So for us, the question is what kind of obligation, eventually maybe legal obligation, should you have? How to make it operational, I wouldn't know. But I think people at my age remember what a revelation it was when you could take your phone number from one provider to the next provider, and the provider was responsible actually to do the change. And it did not take 30 days without the phone number. That was more or less the situation in my home country before things changed. And to some degree, you feel that that is still the situation right now, that I would literally be responsible myself to take my data to another provider. So it has happened before, but how to operationalize it, I'm not the right to ask.
But technology is there to make things easy to use for consumers, not difficult, right?
Would be my guess, yes.
Exactly. We have our CEO, Karel, who wants to ask a question.
Commissioner, thank you for presenting this at CEPS and discuss this at CEPS today, just after the press conference in the Commission. A question on digital sovereignty and on digital autonomy. If you see that the biggest providers in the world are basically 2 to 1 trillion companies. So they are huge, they have enormous power, and then we propose a package where we have a fund of 2 billion. Is this not an illusion? And then secondly, if you ask yourself the question, let's say, I mean, if we were to have got this package 10 years ago, would we have got today more digital autonomy? So what is the reason that Europe is totally left behind in this domain, that we don't have data clouds of ourselves?
Well, I think one of the reasons, unfortunately, is a very old school one, that we are not sufficiently thorough in having a single market. That we thought it was something we established, and then we looked away, and then when we looked back, all kinds of barriers have grown up. For me, the single market is like a lawn. You have to move it every week, because otherwise weeds will be sneaking in, and all of a sudden there's a small tree, and if you forget about it, you don't have a lawn anymore. You just have a mess. And the thing is that the US giants and the Chinese giants, they grew up in a single market, a big single market. And they were able to develop their capacities from that, to take their own capacities, for instance, for clouds. For cloud, if you need to process, I don't know how many orders on Singles Day or Black Friday, then you have a lot of capacity. And you can make a spin-off business from that. So when you get started in a big market and you can scale up from that, then you can scale up your side business as well. And that is one of the reasons why we will also soon come back with a strategy on our single market. Because to some degree, our single market for goods will have to have a much more integrated digital and digital services dimension. Otherwise, we will make it very difficult for all the potential that we have in the business-to-business technology and the industrial data and the Internet of Things data that is being created right now to have the opportunity to scale up. So we have to make sure that we establish the most fundamental, which is a single market for AI and digital solutions that really works. And this is also why the data strategy has this idea of a single market for data. Because otherwise, I think it will be very difficult to meet the challenge of scaling up and to have some punch with these new areas that develops. And that may sound very, very old school, but nonetheless, it is one of the essentials.
Very good. We go back there. We had a question there. No, here. Close to you, Tina. Please signal that.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Claire Rowley, and I represent the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation. Europe is really a global leader in standardizing legal entity identification in financial markets, and this is a very good representation of data strategy because you have the financial authorities. They are focusing on evaluating risk in markets rather than just trying to determine, are they speaking about the same entity across the national borders? And my question here is focusing on standards and perhaps also leveraging existing data flows and lessons learned. And perhaps it's in the governance structure, the sandbox, but is there also an idea to look at successes in one sector that could be extrapolated to others, and also simply harmonizing, perhaps using international standards or existing identifiers to ensure that principle you mentioned, you are what you eat, that the quality of data that's made available, especially by the public administrations within Europe, are of the highest quality?
The strategy entails a number of different things, and you're completely right to say that some sectors has been forward in a number of respects because they're very digital by now. At least part of the sector, I think, for the financial sector, part of the financial sector is extremely digital. Others still not so much. So you have the variation also within the sector. One of the things that will trigger recognition with us and where we would love to have the inspiration is, of course, standardization. I think everyone would wish that technology now was in all respects so advanced that you could just have your data in a pile and it would still work. That is still not exactly the case. So some kind of standardization in order for data to be readable when matched could be one of the enablers that you would think of. When it comes to existing identifiers, I wouldn't know exactly what you're thinking about. We have ideas about identification because we think it would be great if we could provide Europeans with the option to have an e-identity so that you could identify yourself, and that would be for real recognized cross-border. We have a lot of the legal basis to do that, but it has not traveled well. I think you have the good examples in Estonia, in my home country, Denmark, a couple of other places, but that you would have an identity that would allow you also as the customer uniquely to identify yourself. Because then you would have a tool that would give away so much data that you could be identified, but would not have the feature to collect data about you in whatever thing you were doing. And in that respect, I think there's a lot of things to be learned. I think the Estonian example actually came from the financial sector that started as banking ID and then grew from that to be something that is now widely used, and also for Estonians living outside of Estonia, for them to be able still to connect with the services that they need. And in that respect, I think that the old saying that every problem is solved somewhere, you just need to find the solution and then apply it on unsolved problems of the same nature. I think that very well could be the case also here.
Lisa, okay.
Lisa for Ethno. Ethno is the leading telco association here in Brussels. Thank you very much, Vice President, for a very interesting presentation of the 3 strategies. We talk a lot about data pooling, about AI, and we need to have really good and trustable data. Isn't it then an issue that the member states have sovereignty when it comes to security? So cybersecurity is up to the member state itself. And I think security will be a huge issue for the trust, both in AI and the data itself.
The thing is that it creates a lot of ownership. And I'm quite enthusiastic about the model that was chosen when it comes to how to make sure that 5G is safe. It was under the leadership of Julian King and Maria Gabriel in the Juncker Commission, where the first steps were taken with member states to assess the risk in every part of the 5G value chain. And then the decision with member states and member states in the driving seat to develop the toolbox, then to do something about the risks that you have found in the value chain of 5G. And here the Commission has been a partner, keeping people together, making sure that everyone talks, that things are actually shared and assessed in a way that is shareable all over. And this is a new approach, and I really like it, because as I said, there is a strong sense of ownership, because security is 100% member state competence, but there's also a very sort of pragmatic, no-nonsense realization of the fact that we are only as strong as each and every one of us. And maybe that method is also useful in other areas, because I think it travels well, because it is difficult to do these things alone. But I definitely don't think that we live in times where anyone would be willing to sort of treaty-wise to sacrifice that kind of responsibility to something common. And here I find that this kind of pragmatic way of solving things, that works quite well.
We had a question there, then we go here and there.
So Falk Steiner from the Bertelsmann Foundation. I heard that you are a little bit like skeptical of all too wary language. I'm not sure whether Thierry Breton has already heard that. So he uses phrases like data wars. So when it comes to avoiding conflicts internationally, we always see that it needs something like robust institutional approaches. When we're looking at the WTO, for example, right now, we're seeing that it's not in its best shape at the moment. And many of the agreements the WTO is dealing with don't cover all aspects that we're talking about today. So do you want to push forward an initiative or something like that, like solving new conflicts that arouse from our new regulatory, ideas?
Well, first and foremost, we try to present what we want to do in a way so that people do not misunderstand and think that we want a conflict. Because this is about us. This is not about picking a fight with someone else. And if we are lucky and clever, then we can get sort of our own house in order so that we can say to Europeans, well, in this way, we actually think that we can make the most of technology because we can manage the risks that will always be there. if we can do that, then maybe we can inspire. But maybe it's a little bit too much to say, we have this idea and now they're on paper, so now the rest of you go do the same. I think it's a good idea first to put some substance and some calories into the discussion, and to see, well, what kind of decisions can we take to actually, as said, make this operational. It also took quite some time before the GDPR started to travel. I think in the beginning people thought, what are they thinking? They're crazy. Never, never, ever going to work. Europe will just isolate itself with these ideas about the integrity of the individual. And yet, I think slowly but surely, a lot of the skeptics are proven wrong. Maybe also some of the most optimistic are proven wrong, because as said before, we still have some way to go before people feel in control of their rights. But I think it has traveled more than what the most pessimistic would have thought. And this may travel if we get the job done. And if we can show that in our democracy, with all the weaknesses and the time consuming and the dispute in a democracy, we can find solutions that will actually work. Then I think we can aspire to maybe to inspire other people.
I have 4 questions, maybe 5, but then of course we will start wrapping up, because I think we wrap up by 5:15. I might also want to ask something at the very end. But please, so please try to be as concise as possible.
Kurt Geisert, I'm one of the guides in the House of European History, and we had already the honor to have you in our museum. We all Google when we search something. 10 years ago, there was the idea that it would be good for the independence of the European Union to have a European search engine. Is it still a good idea?
Yeah, well, it's some time ago I stopped doing that. So I would use Clicks, which is a German search engine. I would use Quant, which is a French search engine. I don't use Schätznamen because it's mostly in Czechish, but there are European alternatives. The tricky thing is, of course, for that to get volume. Then you also have US alternatives that rely on Bing as their basic search engine, and you have Bing in itself. But change only comes if people find that this is a good alternative, and they're willing to put in a little bit of sacrifice. Because, for instance, the search engine I use, they don't know my localization. So when I want falafel, I have to say, well, falafel Place Flachet. And then, of course, I will be told, well, where can I get my falafel around Place Flachet? But I cannot just say near me, because they don't know where I am. And that, of course, is an extra step for me to put in, but I have the pleasure of the fact that they do not know initially where I am. And that is, of course, I think what people sometimes oversee, that different search engines have different qualities. But that never, ever changes the fact that if people are happy with the service, they use the service. And that is perfectly fine if the service provider then lives up to what you would expect of a service provider. Because I think that one of the reasons why Google is so big in Europe, I think probably even bigger than in the US, is that people like the services. And then, of course, it's for me as a law enforcer and for the Parliament and the Council as legislator to make sure for me that things are not illegal, and for the legislature to put down a framework so that there's room for other people as well.
Very good. We go to the back of the room.
Hello, my name is Angeliki Dodopoulou. I'm working as Senior Manager for Highway Technologies in Brussels. I would like actually to ask how the GDPR interacts with all these technologies, also AI, but also blockchain eventually. And what do you think that will it be a good, let's say, combination of AI with, for example, 5G and such technologies? Are you forcing to publish something to explore the interoperability between all those technologies? Thank you.
Well, I think here the main challenge is that artificial intelligence is so many different things. And it's a wonderful catchphrase because it gets your attention. Because, oh, it's like me, only in a better way. And the sad story is that it's not. It's so far away from human intelligence than imaginable. This combination of data and algorithm and computing power that in different ways can give the machine the capacity to learn from the processing, to understand patterns and to process data in amounts that we are not at all capable of. But it's still a very sort of wide scope of technologies and used in so many, many, many different ways, with everything from very personal data to data that is absolutely generic about the weather or soil quality or something that has absolutely nothing to do with people. That makes it difficult to say, well, exactly this combination with this will enable this. One thing that I'm looking forward to is, of course, that we get 5G connectivity, because that will allow exactly for industrial use of the connectivity. Maybe it's not so much for private use, but for businesses, and especially large scale, for public services, then 5G will be a thing in itself, no matter if it's one or the other or the third kind of technology that they use in order to provide their services.
All right, there's a question over there. You already have the microphone. Please stand up and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ruben Sansom. I'm representing Dutch businesses and SMEs, or at least interning for them. And my question is with respect to AI. You mentioned how it's important not only to invest in new research and innovation, but also to make the outcomes of that research available to companies and also to small companies such as SMEs. And you mentioned these hubs as a method for doing so. Now, how should we imagine these hubs if I own a small business in one of the member states? Are these digital development hubs coming to me, or should I be proactive and join one? How is this going to pan out?
Well, I think both things are very important, because if you don't know it's there, you hardly go looking for it. So it has to be a thing. You have to have sufficient size and volume for people to realize, oh, if I grow the ambition also to use these kind of technology in my business, actually there's where I can go. The experience so far is quite good, with businesses coming and sandboxing and trying to figure out, is this something for me? Can I sort of reinvent my business idea if I digitalize it, to test it out? And I think that is very important, that you are able to test things before you sort of fully start to transfer, because then things start to change and it may be costly if you then want to reverse it. The thing is, and the reason why it's so important is that on a very generous day as this one, you'd say that 20% of Europe's SMEs are digital. And that's on a very generous day. So the potential is big. And I think right now, with filled order books, a lot of SMEs have been very busy the last couple of years. And that's, of course, a good thing. And then also maybe I've heard about this, oh, this being digital is something, and I need 5G to do that. But for many businesses, you can easily get started with 4G. Go, 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 go. And this is why I think talking about it, promoting it, enabling it, know that there are services that will help you, but you can only do so much to promote it. The idea is the most important idea is the one in the head of the people who are in the business.
All right. This is, as far as I know, if I haven't missed anyone, the last question that I'm collecting. Please.
Thank you, Andrea. This is Ezequiel Dominguez. I'm with Calen International. Maybe my question is obvious, but I think it's important. And you said that it's about enforcement and who does it. I'm surprised no one asked. But again, maybe it's obvious to many, but not to me. I guess maybe if you can narrow down the possibilities. You said that you are seeking comments about this. but telco operators, so regulators are, all the data is running through the networks, and regulators of telcos have quite a lot of experience in imposing ex-ante regulation, but is it the data protection authorities? If you can give us some more light into this.
Well, I think it may be an obvious question, but it's also a very tricky one, because as I said initially, these are some of the things that we discussed the most. Who is doing what? Where are the jobs created? Where are the funds being spent? And this is why we are setting out for discussion sort of a double approach to say, well, on the one hand side, it's important that things can take place in member states, but if we want to have a single market for artificial intelligence, well, the assessment that should make us trust artificial intelligence will have to be more or less the same. Because if not, well, why would they in France use artificial intelligence that has been assessed in Denmark, and vice versa? So that is sort of the crunchy point. But we have not nailed that down in any specificities, and I would guess that this is one of the things where people would give their input. And I find this to be very important. Because if people are to trust that there are actually things that you should live up to, they should also be able to trust that there are enforcers. And that if you do not live up to what you're supposed to live up to, there will also be sanctions. And that system will have to be designed, of course, in a way that supports what we want to do, but it will have to be designed. So no, I don't think that your question is obvious. And one of the reasons why we do ask in a 12-week public consultation is exactly to get input and answers to these kind of tricky things. How to make sure that you, on the one hand side, are on ground, while at the same time that you do something that everyone else actually respects when there are things at stake, which is risk to fundamental issues.
All right, so let me allow maybe to follow up on this question, last question by Ezequiel, on a bit more specific issue, which is there seems to be in between the lines a reference to the need for some institutional mechanism or some body or some board at the central EU level that helps in the, for example, in the identification of high-risk applications, in updating information or spreading more regulatory certainty as to which practices or current ways of doing business or current techniques are likely to be compliant with trustworthy AI principles. Do you see this as a concrete possibility to appoint an institution like this or a body like this, and what kind of body would you have in mind, if you can say, of course?
Well, CEPS, obviously.
That was my proposal.
Well, actually, it's kind of on purpose not to venture into this question. Because for me, the important thing is to figure out what is it that we want to do. Because that is difficult enough already. The scoping, what should be sort of, what is it that we want to have a say? And if we want to have a say, what is it that we want to say? And is this actually something that we can enforce? That's the important thing. Because I have seen many Commission proposals over the years so far, and they always have an agency somewhere. And maybe we could sort of reverse the debate and then first say, what is it, what task is it that should be solved? And then eventually construct the best possible enforcement landscape and governance structure that will actually make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So I will, I tend to agree completely with you on this and on many of the other things that you've said. It's time to wrap up. It's time to thank you again for being with us. With one thought, you might agree or disagree, but my impression out of this discussion and out of reading the package is that while your mandate is explicitly about making Europe fit for the digital age, this package is also a little bit about making the digital age fit for Europe, right? So I don't know if, of course, this is not something that could be put explicitly in your mandate. It would have been perceived as arrogant or dangerous. But I don't know if you agree with me or not, but maybe we can live with this thought in the back of our minds and give a big applause again to Vice President Margrethe Vestager.